Good afternoon. How are we doing? It's 4:30 and there's light outside, so it's all right. Yeah, we're doing well. Um, let's get started. So we give Dr. Taylor as much time as possible to do his thing. Before we get into the talk for today, just a note that the next CFI lecture is on the 4th, February 4th, in this room, same setup, 4 o'clock reception, 4:30 talk. Professor Natalie Carnes is coming to continue discussion on the topic of justice and beauty. She's at Duke Divinity, and so look out for those notices, but I wanted to get the announcement out of the way so you know that on the 4th, come back for more good stuff for the Center for Faith Inquiry. We're here to discuss, however, the Franz lecture today. I welcome you all here and appreciate you coming out on a Thursday afternoon to honor a founding member, a significant member of the history department here at Gordon College. I was calculating it. This is actually the 35th year of this lecture, but we've had 33 lectures because of COVID and things. So in a couple of years, we'll be having a big event for that. But 18 months ago, the home of the Franz lecture moved from the Social Science Division to the School of Humanities and Social Sciences as we shifted over. And so while change can be stressful, we sort of try to figure out how we're going to organize that. It also gave us an opportunity to reaffirm and to rearticulate the importance of the work of David Franz and why this lecture matters. So I want to say a little bit about that, the centrality of his vision for Gordon College and places like Gordon College. In 1951, Dr. David Franz came to teach history as one of the founding, maybe the founding member of the Department of History. There was no Department of History at that time, but a few years after he was here, there was one. So he came in 1951 to teach history. In 1958, to expand his vision of bringing Gordon students into critical scholarly engagement with the broader world, he began an annual lecture in which he brought significant scholars to Gordon College in order to expand and give an opportunity to learn from folks outside of our own faculty. That same year, Dr. Franz also, same year, brought Gordon students out into the world, right? When he pioneered, and it's really it's true, one of the first significant global education programs in this country, right? The European Seminar, which took students from Gordon College, as long as he was here after that, to places in Scandinavia, in Russia, Europe, Israel, et cetera. And there's many people, some people here probably, who participated and had that first significant moment abroad with his teaching in lots of places, way ahead of our time. And those who have benefited from global education policies now at a small college like Gordon College benefit in part because of that legacy that turned and created, really, to be honest, a significant global studies program here at Gordon College for a small place that we're at. As we approach the 70th anniversary of these two exceptional innovations and the 35th anniversary of the Franz Lecture, the School of Humanities and Social Sciences is honored to continue Dr. Franz's legacy of expanding minds and hearts for the kingdom of God with our invitation of Dr. Taylor today. So that notion of expanding the mind to understand God's kingdom is what we're continuing today with our lecture. So a bit about our speaker. Well, James Taylor and I arrived at Gordon in the same year. I won't tell you when. It didn't start with a 2, but it was a long time. He was not, I was, he was a student, so that's okay. But if I had the power to grant a gift to new faculty members, it would be students like James, right? It's like easy. It's like showing up, and it's like I had these students who just wanted to do things, and it was really exceptional. He came to us a bit later than most, as he had commitments to professional surfing and an active entrepreneurial spirit that led him to create a number of businesses, you can ask him about them, in his home in Southern California. At a certain point, however, the Socratic dictum that the unexamined life was not worth living took hold, and off he came to the North Shore, to Gordon College. His passion for thoughtful questioning led him from a degree from Gordon to a master's program at Loyola Marymount, and finally to a PhD from Boston College. A traditional career in academia perhaps was the plan at that moment, but at Boston College, James was soon playing a major part in organizing and supporting a new initiative that was co-directed by his advisor, Richard Carney, called the Guestbook Project, which is still up and running today and still doing lots of good things. This endeavor, which examined the nature of and the hope for hospitality in a world too often torn by violence. This experience, combined with ongoing reflection with his wife Petra, of her experience growing up under the clouds of war in Croatia, planted a seed that led them to propose a semester-long program focused on the study of conflict and peace in the Balkans and beyond. And so in the spring of 2014, the first cohort from Gordon and a few other CCCU schools arrived in Croatia. The program also led to the creation of the European Center for the Study of War and Peace in Zagreb, and new programs with Harvard, Loyola Marymount, and Boston College. Well, I could list James's many other accomplishments, which include books and studies in peacemaking, in the work of the French philosopher Michel Henry, and others. I will conclude this little introduction with a personal testimony. In May of 2014, the late Judith Olson, Dan Johnson, Paul Brink, and I jumped on a plane immediately after commencement and showed up to conclude this first semester in the wonderful and exceptional city of Dubrovnik. It wasn't that city that was marvelous as it was that amazed me, at least. It was the first encounter with those students who had just spent 2 or 3 months with James and Petra. The depth of their understanding and their sort of the questions that they asked and the sort of qualitative transformation in our advisees that we knew quite well challenged us. And we had talks in our morning classes, at dinner at night, and we were there for the sun and the fun, and we're just getting pushed every day with questions that, well, I'm not sure we still are. We had a thing last night, and we're still trying to answer them, right? But it was an exceptional experience. In fact, the program just celebrated its 10th anniversary. We had a wonderful time with lots of family folks, lots of the former students came out celebrating the time that they had had and what it had done for their lives in Croatia. And so, I can think of no better example of David Franz's commitment to expanding the minds of Gordon students than what I have witnessed in the programs that James and Petra have created in the Balkans. And so I am both immensely pleased and honored to invite him to come to speak to us about Shalom, both as a gift and a task. James.
Thank you, Mark, for that introduction. It really is an honor to be here. Gordon has been so formative in my life, and I have a deep love for Gordon. I think many of you know that, so it's really nice to be back here. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks to the School of Humanities and Social Sciences as well, and to Lauren Colt for her help in organizing the event. And I should say a word, too, about David Franz, about Dr. Franz, who I hope we are contributing to his legacy through our own attempts to introduce students to other cultures and to bring that sort of kingdom mentality to these other places. I want to start by talking a little bit about the kind of crisis we're in today. So I hope this will end in a happy way and be a joyful experience, but I think we have to acknowledge where we are today as well, and that is a somewhat precarious position. I must admit that I feel now more insecure than ever as to the long-term safety of my family in Croatia. My wife and co-director at the European Center for the Study of War and Peace lived through the war in the Balkans in the 90s. This is a picture here of where she grew up, a town called Slun, a beautiful bucolic place, quite lovely. But as a young person, her life was torn apart by violent war. She was in a particularly dangerous situation because she is half Serbian and half Croatian, which means, when ethnic tensions rise, puts her in a dangerous spot because she's considered a traitor to both sides. You don't trust someone who's half Serb and half Croat. So she was a refugee for a number of years, from the time she was 11 to 14. And that was something that we reckoned with a lot as we were working through the program that we run, thinking about violence, wrestling with the challenges of peace. And over those years, I actually allowed myself to dream that those sorts of problems, we would talk about them, we'd explore them, but to dream that those sorts of problems were mostly behind us. I mean, in principle, I know that's not the case, but in practice, you want to say, okay, that stuff, that had backwards stuff about ethnic division, violence across religious lines, and so on. That's in the past. We're beyond that now. But Petra never allowed herself that, because she had a firsthand view of how easily the surface of life can be ripped off and revealed as a lie, and how quickly violence can overrun a land and a people. As the world convulses toward violence today, it's important that we think carefully once again about peace, and specifically about shalom. I'm calling our attention to shalom not simply because most of us share this conception as essential to our faith traditions, but because I believe it harbors something essential for us today, something that may be uniquely capable of responding to our current crises. We're familiar with the beautiful biblical imagery of the lion laying down with the lamb and of swords being turned into plowshares. And we know the characteristics of shalom that biblical scholarship and theology has taught us. A holistic and inclusive picture of human beings living harmoniously on this earth in flourishing communities, with an emphasis on justice for the marginalized and right relationships among every living being. We admire this picture and want it desperately, especially as it seems to drift further away from us. But the real question is not what shalom looks like, but how do we get from here, overrun by violence, to there, where violence is replaced by the joy of sharing our life with our friends, neighbors, and strangers. So the question I want to ask is, by what power do we achieve this picture of shalom? My thesis is that shalom is not only a holistic and harmonious community, but a creative and dynamic way of life that works through us to animate our feelings, thoughts, and actions to make us fully alive. Shalom is a living peace, not simply the consequence of a life well lived, but the quality of that life as it lives and grows within us. It is this life growing within and through us that results in that harmonious and flourishing community life that the prophets evoke and that we today are so desperate to experience. This definition of shalom may not seem especially revolutionary, but the call to live from life flies in the face of a common assumption that in today's violent world, one must rely on violence to bring about peace. In a world of despots and gangsters, we are told the view that nonviolent action can achieve peace is naive and childish. We today must make the hard decisions and use violence wisely, judiciously, to hold large-scale violence at bay, to generate the order necessary for life to flourish to the degree possible. The problem with this assumption is that it misunderstands peace as the absence of violence. It uses violence to limit violence, and therefore, ideally, to bring about a tenuous peace. But violence cannot bring about peace because violence is not creative and does not make life grow. This is the confusion. Violence believes it can use death to generate life. But life only comes from life, not from death, as the world believes. The idea that life comes from death and that peace comes from violence has a long and distinguished pedigree. We find this displayed in most of our origin stories and in an especially clear manner in the Babylonian Enuma Elish. We are told that the primordial divine waters, Apsu and Tiamat, mingled and produced divine offspring. When the young gods became unruly and began to disturb the father god, Apsu, he devised a plan to kill them. The offspring god, Ea, got word of this and conspired to strike first, ultimately killing Apsu. This murder enraged the mother god, Tiamat, who later sought to kill the other offspring in turn. In response, the council of young gods appointed Marduk, the craftiest of the young gods, I think we have him displayed here, to kill Tiamat, promising him their allegiance should his plan succeed. Marduk blew a great wind into Tiamat, and he shot an arrow that pierced her belly. exploding her into two pieces. Her exploded body would serve as the two central building blocks for the cosmos, with one half forming the heavens and the other the earth. Marduk then sacrificed Kingu, the rebellious leader of Tiamat's army, and formed men out of his blood and bone to till the land and serve the gods. There are many important details to this myth, but we should notice two things. First, violence is not accidental to the establishment of the cosmos. It is essential and generative. Second, this violence takes place through a theogony. That is, generative violence is essential not only to the earth and sky and mortals, but prior to all that, to divinity itself, and therefore to the essence of reality. The violence through which the cosmos and humans are created, and that humans will in turn enact with great enthusiasm, is therefore only one more link in an already established violent chain that begins not with the rage of the gods, but with the coming to be of the gods. Commenting on this story, philosopher Paul Ricoeur remarks that here, quote, violence is inscribed in the order of things, in the principle that establishes while it destroys. Violence gives life by taking it away. We can also discern here a central facet in the logic of this creative violence, this supposedly creative violence, namely that a harmonious cosmos can only be brought about by a judicious use of violence. Peace requires the violence of a strong wind and a carefully aimed arrow by which the chaotic waters are forced back from their indiscriminate mingling and held at bay. Marduk qualifies as supreme ruler precisely insofar as he applies violence in the right way to generate order and therefore peace. When something threatens this order in turn, humans must follow the lead of the gods by using violence wisely to reestablish this order. This story serves not only, therefore, to justify all sorts of human violence, but to provide an actual roadmap for how to generate peace. Not through unbridled rage, but through a careful employment of targeted violence against greater and more unruly forms of violence. The Enuma Elish starts with conflict, chaos, a wild profusion of intermingling waters, arbitrarily mixing and surging to violently produce life. And it counsels violence in turn, so that order may be established and peace may at least provisionally prevail. The Genesis account is starkly different, in that it provides no role at all for violence as a generative element in the creation of the cosmos, and points us by contrast to a radically different way of living, based solely on the gratuitous generation of life. We must admit that the biblical creation account is less about the creation of the cosmos than about who we are as human beings, but it does tell us vital elements about both. An important difference that we notice right away is that creation is not wrought through a struggle of the gods with primeval forces, but through God's word. God said, "Let there be," and it was. Another important difference is that God notes his creation is good, and in fact, very good. He is not craftily devising a strategy to bend recalcitrant forces to his will, but rather creating freely through his word and delighting in its goodness. In this regard, there's very little drama and nothing to indicate that in God himself anything like a theogony takes place. Reality itself, God himself, is not constructed through violence as chaos is reined in and made subservient to order, but is himself the already complete and good source of his good creation. This beginning may lack the blood-curdling drama of the Enuma Elish, but it alerts us to a very different and no less dynamic order of things. The garden, likewise, although a result of God's act of separating and binding, is not a productive violence, not a product of violence. It is given as bountiful and self-replenishing provision for the land first, and then for the animals and for man and his partner. Creation of the cosmos and of all that dwells in it is portrayed as a gift, rather than as a burden of subservience, as it was for the humans created out of Kingu's blood. God does not give Adam and Eve tasks. God does give Adam and Eve tasks, of course, but these have to do with tending to what has been given rather than with completing the creation through violent means. The task is to receive, to accept, to name, to cultivate, and to dwell together with God. Also, of course, not to eat of the tree of knowledge, which we will come back to shortly. Life is given here in a way that does not in any form depend on death. That is not to say that death is impossible here, a point theologians have argued over for years. But it is clear that death is not generative, that life is given freely and in such a way that life is the source of Adam's living. God gives his spirit, nephesh, life, as he makes mankind in his image, and it is this life that animates man. Insofar as God is not generated through a violent overcoming of violence, but is eternally himself as good and loving, man too is not violent, but essentially good. And God exults in this fact. This life is freely given, but it is anything but passive. Not only is the whole garden alive and growing, but Adam and Eve likewise are enlivened and growing, helping each other with their tasks and walking with God who comes in the evening. We can learn a great deal about how Shalom accomplishes its purposes by comparing the tasks given to Adam and Eve to those assigned to Marduk and the humans he created. Whereas Marduk must blow a huge wind to force the chaotic waters back, and whereas he can only achieve order in the cosmos by piercing Tiamat's belly, and where humans born of blood and bone are created to labor for the gods, Adam and Eve receive the gift of life, dwell within it, grow from it, and ultimately cultivate it within themselves and in the earth around them. There is no violence here that needs to be, even tragically, done to others or to the world, but rather an attentiveness to life and a working to allow that life to increase. Such a picture of life freely given and received and growing of itself into ever fuller relational well-being presents a problem to the modern mind insofar as it is left wondering why and how evil would enter into such an idyllic world. If violence is not required to order reality, and if it is not found already in the divine, where and why does it originate? The paradox that the biblical account asks us to grasp is that it is the gift character of creation, God's own goodness, manifest in himself and in his abundant gifts, that tempt Adam and Eve to violence. Why would a gift cause violence? We know why violence is necessary according to these other violent origin stories. Chaos must be reined in, order established, and violence is the only means to do so. But why would the freely given gift of creation tempt us to a violent response? To grasp why Adam and Eve chose to eat of the tree of knowledge, we need to understand why that possibility was tempting in the first place. Precisely within this idyllic garden that gives and replenishes itself abundantly, Adam and Eve were anxious. They were not afraid of death, because they didn't know death, nor were they worried about sickness. They weren't menaced by this or that external threat, but rather by themselves. The very fact of experiencing a self, of receiving this self, and precisely the gift quality of this self, created in them a deep anxiety. Think for a moment of just how radical this gift is. It is not as though Adam and Eve were first themselves, already existing, and then given the gift of life. They were given themselves by the same process that came to life. For to be a self and to be alive is the same thing. They were born into life and simply found themselves living, which means they found themselves exposed to all the contents of life, all kinds of sensations and feelings, love, desire, pain, elation, all the affective elements, the affective elements that make up the experience of life. These internal experiences are not other than Adam and Eve, but are their very selves. the content and form of their lives. These contents are suffered by Adam and Eve, not in the sense that they hurt, but in the deeper sense that they undergo these experiences fully and completely without distance. In a real sense, Adam and Eve live their lives insofar as their life lives them. Selfhood is given to Adam and Eve not as one among other objects they manage, but as something they must undergo. In this sense, we are all Adam and Eve. We too are born into life, find ourselves living and immersed in our affective content. French philosopher Michel Henry explains that life is not biological, but experiential. In life, we experience ourselves as affected by ourselves, and through that affection, by everything else, including the world around us. That we did not bring about this experience means that it was given to us, to each of us, that each of us lives from a life which precedes us, creates us, and gives us to ourselves without us having any say in the matter. This givenness creates within us an overwhelming anxiety that we seek often to relieve by distracting ourselves from ourselves. It is from within this deeper understanding of the gift of life as producing this anxiety that we can understand why Adam and Eve succumbed to temptation. The serpent's initial provocation, has God truly said, can be viewed as Eve's externalization of this nascent desire to alleviate the burden of living by separating herself from life. In effect, the serpent is tempting Eve to hold life at arm's length, to look at it, to evaluate it, and ultimately to determine when and how she interacts with it. Life is therefore no longer the internal source of Eve's living, but has become an external object that she regards. But this externalizing of life creates a new problem as well. Since life has become other to her, she now struggles to possess it and enters into competition over it. We can understand the serpent's second provocation, God knows that your eyes will be opened and you will be like him, as a manifestation of this new rivalrous relationship to life. With life now as an object over which they compete, rather than as the animating source of their living, the land ceases to give so abundantly, childbearing is exceedingly painful, and domination and subordination come to characterize the relation between husband and wife, and ultimately among men on earth. The curse is not so much a punishment as a choice. Genesis describes the new arrangement sought out and achieved by Adam and Eve in their desire to control their lives rather than to receive themselves as the gift of life. I have presented this process that we classically know as the fall, although we can talk about terminology there, in two steps. But this is really just one movement in which Adam and Eve flee their inner experience of anxiety by looking for external validation. Jewish thinker Martin Buber explains that Adam and Eve wanted not only to be good, as God had already granted freely, but to see themselves being good, to admire themselves in their goodness, to have knowledge of it and control over it. They wanted to know what God knows about how good they are and how significant, to know and regard the whole world, good and evil and everything in between. The problem, of course, is that Adam and Eve are only good by virtue of being created and animated by God's life. As such, they found themselves on the outside looking in, trying to regenerate goodness for themselves by competing with God and others. The sad consequence of this drama can be seen with Cain, who so values God's regard that he kills his brother out of just that envious rivalry that now determines his relations to others. Rather than living in and through life, Cain has followed Adam in his need to admire himself and to control his significance. Even though God warns him that his regard for Abel's offering does not mean that he is less valuable. Cain's attachment to regard is so complete that his envy overwhelms him and violence ensues. French thinker René Girard helps us to understand how this same dynamic that we see exemplified here in Genesis continues to determine our relationships and why it serves as our most common way of generating meaning. Because, like Adam and Eve, we are anxious and seek outside validation, we envy and imitate those we admire. We desire what others desire, not because the object is inherently valuable, usually, but because that guy over there desires it. And he seems to know what he's talking about. The serpent told Eve that God desires the knowledge of good and evil, possesses it, and doesn't want her to have it. Sure, the apple was good to eat, but the real issue is that the apple would make her significant and independent, like him. Envy, in this way, becomes the vehicle for meaning. I experience my value as a human being insofar as I get what you want. And I experience loss of this value when you have it instead. Cain envies his brother God's regard so intensely that he can't master the sin that is crouching at his door and ready to devour him. When we are overcome by envy and blinded by our passion, we have, Girard tells us, only two choices. We can either kill the person standing in the way of our significance, as Cain did, or, and this is where a more measured violence becomes possible, we find a third party to blame. Remarkably, especially when we value the relationships that we are on the verge of destroying, we choose to save those relationships by casting all of our anger and resentment on another person that is less valuable to us. When we agree together, among those that want to save these relationships, when we agree together to cast our animosity on this third person, we magically restore our threatened relationships. After all, it wasn't you or me that was the problem, but that guy over there, he was the problem all along. Through our scapegoating of this third party, we experience in turn a new sense of unanimity and peace. First, because we suddenly share in our animosity toward this person, this culprit. And second, because when we murder or exile this person, we experience a shared catharsis that reestablishes our relationship. In this way, we generate peace through a judicious application of a lesser violence in the service of a greater good. It is better, Caiaphas remarks, that one man die than that the whole nation perish. The violence of envy leads to the violence of scapegoating. Cain blames God, we know, and Adam, of course, blames Eve, justifying his action by claiming that it was the woman you gave me. Notice that with this shift to envy-based knowledge and scapegoating violence, Adam, Eve, and Cain find themselves in just that order of things that the Enuma Elish portrayed as the originating source of the cosmos. The forces around them are hostile and alien. They must be reined in and bent to serve them by a clever and more targeted hostility. But Genesis places this violent order of things second, not first, as the product of vanity, rather than as the hard-bitten truth about reality itself. From the vantage point granted by this reading of Genesis, we can grasp that the rest of the biblical text is a record of God's attempt to rescue his people from this artificial, violent order and restore them to himself as the real source of life. The text tells explicitly that we cannot return to the garden through our knowledge projects and our control strategies. The flaming sword of fire prohibits this direct approach for us, as it did for Adam and Eve. But there is another and converse approach, made possible not by domination and rivalry, but by the suffering servant who came to bring life and offers, quote, water that will become a spring in us, welling up to eternal life, instead of water guarded carefully and meted out according to one's station, ethnicity, or power. The Messiah subverts our violent strategies and opens to us once again the source of life that we so stubbornly seized and squandered by aiming to control it instead of living from it. Christ gives this life in two steps, which are really one gift. First, insofar as he lives unreservedly from his Father, Christ reveals to us our own violence. His way of living is so contrary to the domineering posturing of the world that his words and actions show at every turn that what we commonly accept as just and moral is actually violent and self-serving. This revelation culminates with his death on the cross. As Girard explains, when Christ freely accepts his violent death while proclaiming his innocence, he reveals himself as a scapegoat rather than as a culprit, and thereby undermines the whole domination project. Through this unmasking operation, we can see clearly for the first time that our own attempts to achieve peace are actually violent attempts to achieve order. Second, Christ not only unmasks the violence at the heart of our peacemaking, but provides us as well with his own life as our animating source, proceeding from the Father and vivifying every element of our being. So, Christ reveals the lie, therefore, but he also gives his own flesh as the very life through which we may come to life. This is a life, we are told, that does not kill to make live, but defeats death, and therefore allows us to live as though death were not. We see in Christ's words and can experience in our relation to him that he gives to us not as the world gives, but abundantly, forgiving us 7 times, 70 times, washing our feet, inviting us off the street to lavish feasts, recklessly multiplying loaves and fishes, and ultimately enduring his sacrifice for our well-being. These illustrations point to Christ's unique capacity to restore us to the fullness of life. It is in this way that we can understand Christ's admonition that he is the way to the Father. For he is the one that by giving us his experience, what philosophers call flesh, makes it possible to live from the Father's life rather than from violence. When Christ gives and we receive this life, he makes us once again children of the Father in the literal sense that our life comes from him, so that we live in and through his life, not metaphorically, but materially. Peacemakers in this way truly are the children of God. Which is why Jesus can reply to his own shocking question, "Who are my mother and brothers?" That whoever does the will of God is my mother and sister, and my brother and sister and mother. To be born again is to be born of God's life, animated by it, experiencing it, as the process by which we experience ourselves, and through which we grow as selves in relation to others and to God. In this way, through Christ's life, death, and resurrection, life ceases to be an object we evaluate and control and over which we compete, and becomes instead, as it was originally for Adam and Eve, the freely given and received inner power by which we feel, think, act, and ultimately love. The Prince of Peace restores us to the original power of Shalom, through which he created us and the world around us. This theology of peace gives us a new understanding of nonviolence and has significant implications for the practical work of peacemaking today. Our knee-jerk idea of nonviolence is that it's a passive withdrawal from the violent challenges of daily life. This avoidance theory is completely off the mark. Practitioners of nonviolence have nearly always insisted upon full and clear-sighted engagement in the conflicts of life, maintaining that what distinguishes nonviolent responses is that they don't respond to violence in kind, but instead with love, which is the only thing that can overcome hate, as Martin Luther King Jr. reminds us. Not only King, but Gandhi, Simone Weil, and others have found that violence must not be repeated, but suffered and absorbed if it is to be defeated. Each of these have found the resources for such an act in Christ's own absorption of violence and in the radical disruption of the cycle of violence it made possible. But the perspective offered here gives us further insight into how this disruption of violence works. To respond to violence non-violently does not mean to allow it to destroy you, but rather to experience that the life from which you live is so much more powerful than violence is. This is what Christ's resurrection demonstrated, that in fact, what can destroy this life is not the violence done to it, but violence done from it. For thereby it changes into something else, a half-life that feeds on the death of others to live. This is the life of Marduk, and indeed of all of us, so long as we follow Marduk in our attempts to generate peace through violence. Simone Weil remarks that the only way to protect myself from harm is through suffering, by which she meant that the real danger is not that I don't suffer the violence done to me, but instead, by responding in kind, become small and petty, a reactionary and calcified shell of a person. At the heart of this question of how to respond to violence is a deeper reality. The Enuma Elish order of things, like the post-lapsarian situation, tacitly endorses a view of human beings as fundamentally separated from one another, and therefore as given the task of overcoming that separation, whether for the sake of self-protection, desire for affluence, or companionship, or even for ethical or religious reasons. But this is not the picture we are given through the biblical text that claims we are children of God and therefore all live from the same life. As John reminds us, we are sons and daughters not of our earthly fathers, but of our heavenly Father. And we are therefore quite literally brothers and sisters in this life. The point, therefore, is not to sacrifice with great difficulty our own desires and advantages in order to, quote, make room for the other within our identities, as Miroslav Volf puts it, but to come to experience what is already the case, that insofar as we live within and through Christ, we live within and for one another as well. Thomas Merton poignantly describes the experience of this irrevocable unity when in, quote, Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut in the center of the shopping district, he says, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all these people, that they were mine and I theirs, that we cannot be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness, of spurious self-isolation. The sense of liberation from an illusory difference was such a relief and such a joy to me that I almost laughed out loud. I have the immense joy of being a man, a member of a race in which God himself became incarnate. As if the sorrows and stupidities of the human condition could overwhelm me, now that I realize what we all are. And if only everybody could realize this. But it cannot be explained. There is no way of telling people that they are all walking around shining like the sun. Merton goes on to bemoan that, quote, if only we could see each other that way all the time, there would be no more war, no more hatred, no more cruelty, no more greed. But this cannot be seen, he says, only believed and understood by a peculiar gift. Our task is to experience this gift, and by drawing nearer to the source of this life, to allow ourselves to be enlivened by this life so that we live more creatively and joyfully, allowing life to increase in us and through us so that our joy becomes greater and more complete. From within the giving and receiving of life, we see that violence is not a product of a bad temper, but of a life in atrophy. Violence is what happens when life doesn't grow, and in fact is what is chosen instead of growth as a means of controlling it, and keeping it contained. Violence is the way we intervene in life's creative processes to keep it small and manageable. Over and again, we see that what makes people susceptible to using violence and what makes us susceptible to war is that we are not growing, but are wasting away through vain, envious pursuits, choosing the wide path of scapegoating and social domination to provide meaning, rather than the narrow path of living and growing from within. Like Adam and Eve and Cain, we choose to regard and admire ourselves from the outside, rather than to live from within, and we wither on the vine. What is needed, therefore, now more than ever, is that we re-engage and receive life in all of its gratuitous power and allow it to grow us into full and vital human beings. We need to feel more, think more, create more, ultimately love more, which is what life itself is and does. Shalom, as the inner logos of life expanding us from within, ultimately makes possible those characteristics that we hear so longingly evoked by the prophets. Inclusive and harmonious community, full of justice and love, is the natural outcome of living in and through this life that connects us eternally to each other and to the world around us. The practical work of peacemaking, therefore, first takes place right here in each one of us as we receive the gift of life and undertake the task of living. Thank you.
So we have plenty of time for questions. We're going to let Dr. Taylor field the questions, but Laura and I will be walking around with microphones. If you can sort of put your hand up, we'll try to get there so other people can hear you and can record this. So focus your attention here, but we'll be running around and trying to get a mic to you, so be looking for it. That way.
You said at the beginning you were more concerned about the safety of your family than ever. Could you talk a little bit more about the dynamics that are causing that?
Sure, yeah, thanks for asking. Well, they're mostly geopolitical issues there, having to do with the political state of things, insofar as Croatia is right on the border with Serbia and Bosnia is an especially precarious place right now. There's a lot of sort of fear-mongering from Russia around, and attempts to try to get Bosnia to split off, to get what's called the Republika Srpska, an area of Bosnia, to secede, and that would create a massive instability, which would probably lead to some sort of local war, I would imagine. So those sorts of things, and just the unexpected, chaotic nature of it all. You don't know what's going to happen. A few years ago, I was like, well, okay, something might happen, war might break out again, but we're a ways away from that. And now it just feels much more present, that possibility. So that's what I mean. Yeah.
Is it on?
My question's sort of a working question, so
sorry.
I apologize. But also, thank you so much for the lecture, Dr. Taylor. And can I say they couldn't have chosen a person who exemplified the legacy of Dr. Franz more. Thank you for the impact you've had on my life, especially. Jesus, the Messiah, him being the example, the gift of an alternative way of living towards peace. Especially an alternative to the sort of scapegoating violence that has permeated the fallen humanity. The curiosity I have is, as Jesus is this example and is also the the cause, the reason, even the receipt of this call to peace. It's curious how violence is not just an action, but also an inaction. I'm reminded of the verses in Matthew, I was hungry and you did not feed me. I was naked, you did not clothe me. I was in prison and you didn't visit me. I'm curious, I guess, what this violence that is inaction, how that comes to play into the sort of pursuit of shalom, and then also our call to not just resist the violent act, but also to resist the violent inaction. It's a very working
Yeah,
question.
thank you. No,
I apologize.
that's interesting. Thanks. I have to think more about that to come up with an elegant answer, but let me give it a shot. The idea of life growing, expanding, moving, leads me to think that much of what we see described in the New Testament, and I think this is true, is a lot of it is less a statement as to how we should act than a description of how we will act if we're inhabited by this life, because it's an active life. It's an active, dynamic, creative life. So the inaction is, in that way, indicative of a lack of living in this life, I think, So there'd be a way to think about that, the Good Samaritan, all these other parables and so on, as this is what it looks like to live fully, right? It's not just a law that we must follow or ethical directions. There are descriptions of what this life is and looks like, which is so contrary to how we normally live. And I'm not sure that answers your question as to the problem with inaction. I just don't see on this model, I don't see the inaction as all that different from violent action, right? If life is moving, acting, expanding, and loving in these ways, then either inaction or violent action, they're both of a piece in that they're not inhabited by and growing in and through this life.
Completely agree. It's just the explicit clarification. That's really helpful.
Yeah, okay, great.
Yeah.
So you talk about this sort of free system of I guess harmony and shalom as the alternative to this system of violence that's so common in our world. And you kind of described the way to live into that that shalom system as just sort of I guess experiencing God's love more, and you said create more, and think more and feel more. I'm curious to what extent you think that can be extended, or what scale that can go in terms of peacemaking. Is it necessarily just for? Does it have to be like the church that and in like small Christian communities that emphasize this, or to what extent can that be extended to like governments or political systems?
Yeah. It's a great question, and it's one we were dealing with last night as well in our little conversation. My sense, and again, this is a work in progress, but my sense is that everything is ordered toward the expansion, the growing of this life. That's my view as a Christian, of God's life expanding within us. Now, that will happen in very different ways according to the different vocational spheres you're involved in and so on. But to my view, politics too has that goal, right? Now, it has to make a lot of difficult decisions as to how to achieve that and so on. And not everybody, not all politicians are going to share that view. So I can see this working out in different ways. In terms of the challenge of this, of experiencing this, I mean, maybe the church is where it's distilled, most purely. This is what we're there to do. We're explicit about it. We're there to allow that life to grow in us, to foster it, to foster that in others through all that we do within our church communities. So that's a special sort of concentrated place in which this would happen. But in principle, I don't see why it wouldn't, for a Christian or for certain people of faith, and perhaps for those that don't have faith, insofar as they are also alive, which is everyone, that would also be the case in some way. But I feel like I'm not fully answering your question there. What did I miss in that question?
I guess I'm hoping. Let me think for a second.
Yeah, that's okay. No.
I guess the idea, I've been kind of thinking about the idea of governments and how they're kind of, they're bigger than just individuals, and they have to make really hard decisions. And I I don't know, I think that I I struggle with the idea of governments behaving with, like, in this Christian shalom reality, because it just seems kind of impossible to me, because there's so much involved in a government, and it's so much bigger than what the church can influence. And so I'm wondering if you have any insight into how that could look.
Do you have any, I mean, it's probably not hard to find, but do you have any particular examples of the way in which a government would be unable to do this? I mean,
Well, I mean, just generally with, like, for nonviolence, for example, I think that, you know, the U.S. is very, and most governments are very prone towards violence and war. That's just one example, but.
yeah. Yeah. So one of my colleagues that was mentioned here tonight, Dan Johnson, who was a big part of our Balkans program, lovely person that many here know and love, he said to me one time in a candid moment, we were talking about pacifism and just war and so on. He's, you know, I'm not a pacifist, but I sure want to be. You know, he said, I'm an aspiring pacifist. And I appreciated that because it's honest. I don't consider myself a pacifist in the sense that I would refuse all violence, as though there's a law, you know, never act in violence. What I'm trying to get at here is a different way of thinking about it, which is, insofar as violence generates meaning, that's bad. That's a problem, because life generates meaning, not death. And when we go down that road, we can experience our identities and our sense of self being formed and generated through violence. And the problem is it works, right? It gives us a sense of self and inspires us in a way that is actually violent in itself and leads to greater forms of violence, right? I mean, straight across the board. So the question would not so much be, do you act in violence or peace when you come to this issue? You know, and governments, politicians, and so on, God bless them, they got a hard road because of the things you say. You're going to have to make these decisions. But as we were talking about last night, I think that the distinction there is that the violence done, and that perhaps is chosen to be done, would be an indirect way of facilitating peace, fostering peace, insofar as it would be a necessary, perhaps tragic decision that needs to be made to prohibit greater forms of violence. But the difference is that it's not direct. It doesn't, in and of itself, generate the kind of sense of peace, that social harmony that's built on scapegoating and this kind of hidden murder that forms, I think, so many of our communities and so many of our ways of experiencing ourselves. So does that make sense? So that it's a question for me of how peace and meaning are generated rather than simply acting in violence or nonviolence. Please.
Hey, Professor Taylor. Thank you for sharing. I agree with a lot of things you said. However, I have a question on boundaries, more specifically cultural and religious boundaries, especially from the American perspective. The biggest example that comes to mind when America, or more specifically the United States, involves in foreign wars, you know, it goes in the name of peace and democracy and, you know, the right Christian value, the principle. However, you know, a lot of times that ends up in failure. So how would you say is the best way to administer peace when not everyone shares the same perspective?
Boy, that question I think is above my pay grade. I mean, yeah, no, it's a good question. It might be better suited for a politician. Where's Paul and Ruth? Are you here? Where are you? again, I think all I'd be comfortable saying in that regard is I would hope to shine a light on the fact that many of our wars and many of our forms of violence have the effect, whether intentionally or not, of generating a certain identity through this violence. That we become filled with this kind of energy and this kind of identity. And once you're there, you're locked into a kind of oppositional, enemy-based approach to other human beings, and that's not a Christian, period, in my view. So, since we're all children of God, very literally, right? Not metaphorically, literally. So if that's the case, then I can't have those kind of enemies. I may have to, as a politician or as a military person or something, I may have to make that decision. But insofar as that decision would be fueled by and would increase that sense of animosity, maybe self-importance, that violent sense of self-esteem, a kind of violent self-esteem, then that would be problematic, right? So again, I don't have I can't offer you a geopolitical program, but I would like to point out that much of our violence, even at the geopolitical level, is done for that purpose and with that in mind of generating this kind of violent identity.
Go here. 1, 2, 3.
Thank you. Mine is not really a question, it's more a comment. Firstly, I want to say thank you. It was very insightful. I am from Armenia, and my country experienced war a few years ago, and now is in a state of negative peace. The guns are silent, but they are not dead. And in the beginning, when you were talking about using violence to limit violence, I was thinking about my country. So yeah, I want to say thank you for your insights. And
Yeah, thank you.
I also wanted to thank you for your speech today. It was great. I did have one question. You said at the beginning that life only comes from life, not from death. So my question then is, how do we understand the eternal life that springs from the violence and the death that happened in Jesus' crucifixion?
Yeah, great question. Well, this is tricky. I mean, it's a good point. I actually ascribe mostly to René Girard's understanding of this in a certain sense, and that is that the violence done there to Christ was done from us. It was our violence on Christ, and it was his willingness to absorb our violence and to interrupt our violence, to break that almost ineluctable, that chain of violence that seems to serve as a relay for our own violence that we pass on so easily. His death broke that open in a way to allow us to access the life that he gives, his own flesh. But the distinction there is that his death is not something that is that generates life in the sense that the world sees that. So if we sacrifice others as culprits to provide us with life, we blame others, and that blaming and that violence gives us a new lease on life, creates a social harmony, empowers us, enlivens us in some way. Christ's death did exactly the opposite of that. It wasn't his guilt, in other words, even tragically so, that creates new life for us, but rather his innocence that destroys that sacrificial mechanism. Namely, it destroys the need to murder others to bring about our own sense of self, our own sense of life, and thereby opens us to a whole new paradigm. So that's what I mean by it sort of uncorks that seizure that we have performed on the source of life and gives it to us anew so that we're born again in that way. More to be said there, but I hope that gives you something to work with. Thanks.
Hi. You spoke a little, I think, of the violent way moving towards order that was perhaps illusory or unnecessary, violent, unhelpful. What I'm curious about is what role order has in the peaceful way. or the way of
Hmm.
Shalom? What a peaceful order might look like, or what
Yeah.
types of
Hmm.
practices move in that direction, or is it wholly different than order?
So from what I said, it could seem as though order itself is a problem, or it's just not accounted for in a certain way. But obviously, it's not. Is that your question? It seems necessary. How do you account for a salutary form of order if I've described the Enuma Elish as an ordering through violence?
Yeah. And what's the alternative type of order? What might it look like, even
Mhm.
if we can't see it
Mhm.
entirely? The order that isn't done out of violence and doesn't lead to violence.
Yeah. I mean, even in Genesis, I think we have examples of this, right? The speaking, God speaking, the creation in that regard. There is a movement, right? There's a separating and a binding. There's a sense in which he's organizing things. But the difference is he's not using violence to do that. So the freely given sense of order would be, I think, the paradigm. You don't have, even if there is in Genesis some sense of that kind of, wouldn't even call it a chaos, some would, but a sense of lack of order, that he's coming along and ordering. The difference there is that he's not, that the order is not dependent, it's not established through this violent forming that then needs to be reenacted in order to keep those chaotic primeval forces at bay and so on. It's given and received and proclaimed to be good. Now, what that means for our way of ordering, I'm not sure. I mean, it's a good question. How do we then take that over and see what conclusions can we draw, what insights can we get from that sense of order? I'm not sure. Do you have thoughts on that at all?
I don't know. No.
Yeah.
But
Anybody?
I think it's
Anybody?
part of the answer,
Yeah.
or maybe part of the question then in determining whether we're rejecting parts of the idea of order as we understand it to have a different
Mhm.
type of order, or
Mhm.
maybe it needs a new name then, because the way we understand order is in its nature violent.
You know, I wonder, I think about the difference between Genesis and the Enuma Elish. And one is the way the creation happens, the way the garden takes place, the way that humans interact with God. That's a big deal. But another big difference, it seems to me, is that God is complete in himself, right? I mean, he gives not out of a need, but out of a desire, out of love. So in some sense, the order, and maybe this is a Trinitarian perspective too, the order already exists in this dynamic, flourishing, growing way within God himself. Whereas the other ones, it's almost like we can't make sense of an ordered life without imagining some very chaotic, primeval, bubbling force that then needs to be reined in, and so on. So I guess I would think there's some sense in this religious perspective that order is there from the beginning, already given, right? Already given in the being of God, rather than as something created through, well, it sounds romantic, you're forging these creative order through these hard efforts and tasks and so on. That's not there in the biblical text, as far as I read it, right? It's given, it's already ordered. Our task is to take over that order and cultivate it more, allow it to grow and grow through us. So it's maybe not as, I don't know, bravado based. We don't get the same kind of sense of I really conquered it. But we get the sense of accepting and receiving and cultivating this same thing that's already given in God. I'm sure it doesn't do it, but that'd be my attempt to answer that.
So earlier you said that violence is not accidental, but is in the essence of reality. I just wanted to know what do you mean by that? That was the part that I got a little confused, because if it's not accidental, how does it become reality? And if violence today shows so much power, not saying that I'm pro-violence, but can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure, I think I'm understanding you correctly. That when I said violence is not accidental, that was part of the Enuma Elish program, right? That's that other idea of origin, such that violence is central to the establishment of peace. And my point there was, or at least I was wrestling with that, if that's the case, and that's so contrary to the picture we see in Genesis, that violence is not essential to reality, because God can stand in for reality itself, being, in the Enuma Elish, so that reality itself has violence built into it. And I think we get a very different picture in Genesis. Then the question is, okay, then why does disorder come in? Why does evil enter into the picture? And my claim there was that it's because of the gift, that actually it's the gift that tempts us to this disorder. And I was trying to unpack that by saying, why would we find the gift problematic? Isn't it? It's a gift. Why don't we isn't it great? Well, I love gifts. Why not? But when the gift is so existential, so central to who you are, when you are the gift, it creates an anxiety, the anxiety of living. And I think one of our tasks is to deal with that anxiety in a way that it becomes joy. And that's a hard task. And often we want to take a shortcut, get off that road by engaging in some sort of scapegoating violence. So we would shift in that way that anxiety and that suffering into a resentment. And Nietzsche says this: resentment is a great way of toning down the forces of life. It's a great way of reducing them, making them manageable. We hold it at bay through our resentment, and so that we can live a kind of half life, and go about our life protected from the dangers from the experience of all those emotions, the pain, the joy, the love, the disappointment, all that. Resentment can limit those things and make them more manageable. And what I'm suggesting is that that's exactly contrary to the life that we've been given, because apparently we're supposed to live all of it, right? In its fullness. Yeah. Sure.
Hi, Dr. Taylor. Thank you for your time today. Just a quick question. On the task of living, when you were talking about Eve, you mentioned that life, therefore, had become other to her. In the task of living, within that mindset, is it looking to subvert the mindset that had overcome Eve? And how does that look like in your experience, living that out practically?
Oh, I see. So is the task to overcome Eve's distancing of life? Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yeah. How does that look practically? Was that your question? I was afraid that was your question. Yes. I don't do practical questions, just as a statement. Love thy neighbor. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, I think this is something we've lost sight of in a way. Like, you look at all the church fathers, you look at the monastic life, you look at all that. They understood that this task was central to living and central to peace and so on. And so they would undertake spiritual practices to make that happen. But I don't think that's all there. I think that's a very important element of this, because by that you're able to engage in a life that you wouldn't be able to directly access, right, by engaging in spiritual disciplines and so on. Fasting, giving, solitude, silence, these sorts of things I think are very helpful ways of opening us to God's grace. But beyond that, I mean, to my view, the liberal arts, right, what you're here doing, learning and creating and so on, these are all ways in which life becomes expanded within us. So I really think it's central. This notion of peace as shalom is central to everyone and everything that we're doing. And I think school, like churches have their own way of doing that, I think schools have their own way of doing that also. But everything comes back to this notion of the giving and receiving of life and expanding of life. So practically do that. Yeah.
I'm probably for a couple more. We'll take care of maybe one more.
Thank you for sharing. In some ways, I think you have already answered this question, but I am just curious to hear your thoughts on Jesus' words in Matthew 10:34, when he says that he hasn't come to bring peace but a sword, and that division he brings is within one's household, and also the very violent imagery of taking up our cross and following him, which in some monastic orders is taken to the extreme of self-flagellation. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that violent imagery that Jesus seems to be condoning.
To the second one, I wouldn't condone self-flagellation. I think that's a mistake. I think that's to go way too far in the attempt to open oneself to grace by harming oneself such that one is less able to receive grace rather than more. And that's a balance, but that's not in line with what I'm arguing for, or I don't think in line with what Jesus is advocating. Regarding I came to bring a sword issue, I think, to me, I mean, it's pretty clear. I'm sure you may disagree, but it's pretty clear that Jesus' call to life and peace is so radical that is certainly experienced as a sword to even our most intimate relationships. You know, I came to he's the Prince of Peace. You get a lot of passages you can marshal on the other side, even more. But those passages are relevant too that you mentioned, which are to one who lives by the way of Marduk. Man, this is going to feel like the sharpest of swords, you know, and it's going to divide. There's no getting around it. So that's what I would say. Thanks.
Yeah, one here and then one last one.
Thank you for all of this, but I was asking, what did you think of Shalom in terms of God's examples of violence in the Bible, like the flood and Sodom and Gomorrah?
Yeah, boy, that's a good question. This is something we come across a lot in the Balkans. My wife, Petra, is Joanna here? Joanna? Klein? Okay. Oh, she left, okay. Joanna, come back. My wife teaches biblical literature, and you know, it's interesting. She teaches it, and I'm compelled by this too, as a record of us coming to terms with precisely the shocking power of God's goodness and gratuity. It's a very strange thing to have enter into the world at that point in time in which you have a world just devoted to war, divided up by particular gods, devoted to their own forms of violence, sacred violence, and so on. To have a God who is actually good is a very different paradigm, I think. And I think we can see that if we really look at the narrative carefully, we can see that Abraham, for example, is learning as he goes to really believe that God is good. Apparently, it's very difficult to believe, to trust God and to trust that he is good. He keeps giving his wife away, for example, over and over again, right? Gradually learning over the period, oh, wait, I don't have to, precisely along these lines, oh, wait, I don't have to sacrifice the weak for my own good. But Marduk said I do, right? Everybody is operating in this way. And yet you, God, are telling me that I don't. God is utterly silent when Abraham does those sorts of things to Abraham. And when he's not, when he heeds his call, God's communicating. He's right there with him, encouraging him. But he fails again and again and again. So I really see this as a record of moving toward understanding God's goodness and peace. Now, we'd have to talk in detail about hermeneutic exercise. In what capacity is God advocating war and not? That's probably a longer conversation. But as a general sense, that's what I see happening in the biblical text.
Hi, I'm just wondering, what are your, how do you interpret Catholic doctrine of just war theory?
Can you say just a little bit more, like, what about it are you wondering about?
So how they justify war in the sense as like a last resort when there's no other way.
Yeah.
How do you like feel about that in like a Christian's perspective?
Yeah, I was mentioning this last night to my colleague, Paul Brink, Professor Brink. When he was in the Balkans with us, he wrote this really great essay on just war theory that I often have my students read as part of my class. And so we've been talking about this for many years in the Balkans and so on. And so, you know, I'm working through these things, but where I stand right now on that is that I'm in favor of it, just war, so long as, again, it's not a question, and this is something I don't see talked about as much as I would like, so that it's not a question of deriving one's sense of significance and meaning from the war that is done. I think it's a tragedy. I think that there are cases in which you can probably justify these sorts of things, but I think as Christians, we should be very alive to where our life is coming from. And it's very easy, for reasons I've tried to explain here, to slip into, without even being aware of it maybe, to slip into this idea that that violence and the conflict of that, the energy of it, is giving me a sense of significance. And when it does that, in my view at least, it shuts off the real source of significance. It's one or the other, right? It's not, if my significance is based there, then I'm not receiving my significance from that life that is gratuitously given, and that is love. So it may have to be done, but again, the difference is it done in such a way as to generate meaning or not?
I'm going to call us to a close, something more organized than I made a point to me that I messed up. But I put two things together, so this is actually good. The CFI lecture is the 26th of February. 26th of February. Where did the 4th come from? Here's a good point. On the 4th, in the Lion's Den, at what time? So
6:30, I think?
6:30. If you're interested in this Balkans program that you've heard about tonight, the 4th was the day that was in my mind because there's a sort of information session about that program in the Lion's Den on February 4th. If you have any questions, and Professor Taylor will be there, you have more conversations with him. And on the 26th, we'll have our CFI lecture here in this building. Well, with that done, business done, let's all thank Professor Taylor for a wonderful